Right, morning Rod and Wendy. It was nice to meet you both yesterday, and thank you very much for your purchase. I appreciate you travelled all the way down from Stranraer. As I said to you, the shipping costs now have become extortionate. So this is an assessment of your gearbox that you brought in yesterday, and I found a couple of things that was quite surprising. The gearbox had definitely been rebuilt. I can't tell you how long ago, but it's definitely a rebuilt gearbox. But it's been assembled incorrectly, and that was the root cause of all of your problems that you mentioned, jumping out of third gear especially. Let me just point out a couple of things that was broken. There's a little spring here, and that's a little retaining circlip, and it should look like this. It's a little retaining thing, and it actually sits on the end of the main shaft in a little groove just there on the end of the main shaft, which in turn holds the synchro hub and third gear in place. It stops them from sliding. That stops the end play. That's what that clip's for. That clip was broken, and it wasn't in any way holding the gears from sliding up and down. That sits before the clip, and the clip sits inside that groove there. Now that in turn was making this hub, this synchro hub, sits inside there, inside there like that, turned on its side, sits inside, and that hub then slides accordingly forward to go into fourth gear, and that way back. When you push the stick forward, that moves back, and that goes into third gear. When you pull the car down to fourth gear, that moves that synchro hub forward and into fourth gear. The hub springs and everything were not broken, but you did say your car was jumping out of gear. Now, it's very rare that you find these broken, but it's also very rare to find them in the bottom of the gearbox, and two of those springs and two of those ball bearings were laid in the bottom of the gearbox instead of sitting inside this device here, this synchro hub. Instead of sitting in there, they was laid in the bottom of the gearbox. So this hub, instead of being tight and sprung, because the bearings make this tight and spring inside here, it was moving freely, and therefore it would have just fell out of gear. It wouldn't have. There was nothing holding it in the gear because of that pin. Because of that clip was broken, the whole of this and this gear would have been sliding, and it would have popped those springs out of there. Unfortunately, there was only one left in there, and that was only hanging in. It actually fell out when I came to dismantle it. So that's your main primary reason why it was jumping out of third gear. I don't know what other problems you had, but there must have been several. But that's not a standard bearing. Whoever's rebuilt this gearbox hasn't put the correct bearing back in. That is a sealed bearing, and it should have had a bearing like this one. So that's another. I've never seen one of those bearings installed, and it would have. It's not the correct bearing for the application that it was used for. So that's incorrect. Another fault I found was further down the gearbox. That's your first gear. That's your first gear, sits like that. That's your first gear synchro hub. First and second gear synchro hub sits like that. Then there's supposed to be a bush. This little bush sits inside this gear, like so. It might already be in there. Sits inside there. And that in turn sits on the main shaft. That in turn sits on. It's falling out now. I'm one-handed. But that bush sits inside that gear like so. And this is supposed to be a grooved spacer, an oil grooved spacer. What this is, what was fitted in there, is actually the retainer that stops the bearing. It sits just here on this groove on the main shaft, and the bearing then it stops the bearing from being pushed too far into the tail shaft. So that spacer was actually there, and this spacer, which should have been in that location, because that little groove makes sure that the end of that bush that's in there gets oil. It keeps it lubricated. That was on the here. and it wasn't even on the correct side. It was actually behind the nut that holds the flange on. So that was the wrong washer in the wrong place. So that was assembled wrong anyway. Now the third thing I found was the main bearing, the main rear bearing on the gearbox fits onto the end of, is pressed on obviously onto the end of the into the gearbox case, pressed into the end of the gearbox case on the main shaft, and it should have had a spacer there. It should have had a spacer like this, and it sits on there to protect the face of the bearing, and that in turn would have a circlip like so holding it on, and that keeps the correct spacing, because that's an end float check. You know, there's got to be an end float on there, and that circlip wasn't there, that spacer wasn't there. So the main bearing was held on just with the circlip, which obviously didn't have anything to butt up to. That was pressed too far in with the spacer, so that was incorrect, and that would have caused an issue regarding the end float on the whole assembly, because they're all pressed into tolerance. They're all pressed into a certain tolerance, and it stops the free movement, the lateral movement of the whole gear assembly. So leading on from the broken clip, which somebody's broke when either they broke it getting it off and they've just hoped it would sit in the groove, or they broke it when they've been putting it on, was incorrect. Now behind this nut there should have also been a washer like this on the end of to hold the flange on. There was no washer, that was just held on with a nut. So there was the more important thing, which I forgot to tell you. When I dismantled the lay shaft, when I pulled the lay shaft, there was no pin in the end. See, there's supposed to be a pin in there. Here's a lay shaft. Here's a lay shaft with the pin pressed in. It's a roll pin, and what that does, it stops that lay shaft from turning. As the car's driving and the whole gearbox is in motion, this isn't supposed to turn. It's the cluster gear that turns. So that revolves around this lay shaft. This revolves around this shaft, which is permanently located in the tail shaft. So all that would have been spinning. So the bearings would have had nothing to do in there, because the whole thing would have been spinning. So I don't know if it was a noisy gearbox, or I don't know, because you didn't mention anything about noise, but I'm astounded that you could actually drive the car per se. It would have been probably alright in first and second gear, but when it got up to the top gears, there would have been movement, so much movement here. I'm really surprised that it didn't lock up, because that spring would have locked in that synchro hub. If it had just popped that little bit, it could have locked that synchro hub up, and then you would have been stuck. So all the rest of the gears are okay. The hub, you know, everything's been, whether or not that was a new one, I don't know, but that looks in really good condition. It just needs cleaning up, but yeah, it's a good hub and everything. So I don't know what's happened. The guy has obviously rebuilt it, and he's misplaced a couple of parts, or lost them, or you know, and he's just carried on regardless. So there you go, that's your assessment. So yeah, if you've gone that far with taking the gearbox out, Rod, so I would suggest putting a new clutch in while you've got there, a new clutch plate and a release bearing. They're quite cheap. A&G on eBay, I think I paid 100 quid for mine, and 89 quid. Comes with an alignment tool. But the choice is yours. But yeah, there you go. Thanks again, Rod, for travelling so far, and I do appreciate that. Thank you.